The Carter home on Fairview Lane looked ordinary from the outside. A modest two-story house with a well-manicured lawn and white shutters. The kind of home where people assumed warmth lived within. But for Lily Carter, it was a place of whispered fears and unseen bruises. It was evening when it happened. The event that would change everything. The sky was painted in fading oranges and purples as the sun sank below the horizon. The distant hum of neighborhood life carried through the open window of Lily's bedroom, kids laughing down the street, a car door slamming, the rhythmic chirping of cicadas. Inside, however, there was no laughter, just tense silence. Lily sat on the edge of her small bed, her legs drawn up to her chest. Scout, her golden retriever, rested beside her, his warm body pressed against her leg. He always seemed to know when she needed comfort. Downstairs, voices. It was her mother Sarah and her stepfather Greg were fighting again. Lily tensed. She clutched the frayed edge of her sleeve and tried to focus on Scout's soft fur. The fights were frequent now, like storms rolling in without warning. And just like storms, sometimes they passed quickly, and other times, they left destruction in their wake. Tonight the winds were picking up. The argument had started over something small. It always did. A misplaced phone, a late bill, dinner being cold. But it didn't take much for Greg Turner's anger to ignite into something worse. Lily didn't need to see to know what was happening. She could hear it. The low, clipped tone of her stepfather's voice laced with barely controlled rage. The way her mother's responses got shorter, quieter, as if speaking softly could diffuse the situation. Then, the crash. Something breaking. Scout's ears perked up. Lily flinched. "Why do you always do this?" Greg's voice boomed up the stairs, a mumbled response from Sarah. "I work all damn day, and I come home to this?" Lily squeezed her eyes shut. She knew how this would go. Her mother would try to de-escalate, but Greg didn't want peace. He wanted control. A loud thud, then silence. For a moment, Lily held her breath. Then her mother cried out. Lily jumped up, her heart pounding in her chest. Scout was already standing, alert, his body stiff. Lily knew she shouldn't go downstairs, knew she should stay in her room, out of sight, out of mind. But she couldn't ignore her mother's voice, the sharp, pained sound that wasn't part of their usual fights. She crept to her bedroom door and cracked it open. From the top of the stairs, Lily could see the kitchen. The overhead light cast a harsh yellow glow on the scene below. Her mother was on the floor, one hand gripping the edge of the counter as if trying to steady herself. Greg stood over her, his fists clenched. His face was twisted with anger, his chest heaving. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run down and help her mother, but her feet wouldn't move. Greg took a step forward. Sarah flinched, and then his eyes flicked up and met Lily's. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Greg's expression shifted. The rage didn't disappear. It simply changed form. His mouth curled into something that was almost a smile, but not quite. A warning. Sarah turned, following his gaze, and her eyes widened when she saw Lily. "Go back to your room, baby," she said quickly, her voice shaky. "Now." Lily couldn't move. Greg took a slow step toward the stairs, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet. "Didn't your mother tell you to listen?" His voice was too calm, too controlled. Scout let out a low, rumbling growl. Greg stopped. His eyes flicked to the dog, and for a moment there was something there. Hesitation. Lily took that second to grab Scout's collar and retreat. She stumbled backward into her room, slamming the door shut and locking it. She could still hear them below. Her mother's hurried voice, trying to smooth things over. Greg's shorter, clipped responses. The sound of a glass bottle being set, down too hard on the counter. And then, after what felt like forever, silence. But Lily didn't unlock the door. Lily didn't know how much time had passed before she heard the knock at the front door. At first, Greg ignored it. But when it came again, louder, more insistent, he muttered something under his breath and went to answer it. From her room, Lily listened. Mr. Turner? A man's voice. Firm, authoritative. We had a call from a neighbor about a disturbance. Greg's voice was smooth, controlled. The voice he used in public. No idea what you're talking about, officer. Just a little argument happens in every marriage. A pause. Then a second voice. This one a woman. We're going to need to speak with your wife. Silence. A long, heavy silence. Then Greg sighed dramatically. Sarah? He called over his shoulder. Lily's heart pounded as she heard her mother's footsteps approach the door. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. I'm fine, the female officer pressed. Mrs. Carter, do you feel safe? Another pause. Then Sarah let out a shaky laugh, the kind that wasn't really a laugh at all. Of course. Like my husband said, we had a fight. It's over now. Lily squeezed, her eyes shut. No, it wasn't over. The officers didn't leave right away. They asked more questions, their voices carrying up the stairs. And then, one of them asked about Lily. Greg hesitated. Sarah spoke first. She's asleep. Lily knew it was now or never. She took a deep breath, reached for the doorknob with shaking fingers, and opened it. Scout trotted beside her as she stepped onto the landing. All eyes turned to her. The female officer, Officer Davis, looked at her gently. Sweetheart, are you okay? Lily's throat felt tight. The words wouldn't come. Scout whined beside her. She's shy, Sarah said quickly, but her voice wavered. Officer Davis kneeled. Lily, if something is wrong, you can tell us. You're safe. Lily wanted to speak, but she couldn't. Greg was watching her. Her small fingers curled into Scout's fur. He licked her hand as if encouraging her. And then, before she could second-guess herself, Lily took a single, deliberate step toward Officer Davis. A silent plea for help. Greg tried to argue, but it was no use. The officers knew something wasn't right. Lily didn't resist as she was gently led outside. Scout walked beside her, tail low but alert. Sarah didn't fight it either. She just stood there, arms wrapped around herself as if torn in two. Greg was furious. He didn't yell, not in front of the officers, but his eyes burned with silent rage as Lily was placed in the back of the patrol car. She didn't look at him. She just curled up against Scout's side, pressing her face into his fur, and let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like forever. For the first time, she was safe. The courthouse was alive with murmurs. Journalists crowded the steps, their cameras flashing as attorneys, witnesses, and spectators filed inside. This was no ordinary trial. Greg Turner, a respected businessman with deep community ties, was on trial for child abuse. His arrest had sent shockwaves through the small town, sparking debates about whether the accusations were real or just a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. The courtroom was packed. Rows of spectators leaned forward, eager to witness what promised to be a contentious legal battle. Reporters whispered to one another, taking notes as they awaited the proceedings. At the center of it all sat Lily Carter, small, silent, and overwhelmed. Her therapy dog, Scout, lay curled at her feet, his golden fur a stark contrast to the dark wood of the witness stand. His presence was a comfort, but Lily's hands still trembled slightly as she gripped the hem of her dress. Her stepfather sat across the room, dressed in a crisp suit. Greg Turner looked calm, too calm. His posture was relaxed, his expression confident. Mark Langley, Greg's defense attorney, sat beside him, shuffling through neatly stacked files. Langley was a seasoned lawyer, known for dissecting cases with surgical precision. He had defended powerful men before and knew exactly how to plant doubt in the minds of the jury. At the opposite table sat Daniel Reeves, the prosecutor. He wasn't the kind to rely on theatrics. He built cases with logic, evidence, and strategy. But this case was different. He knew the jury needed to believe Lily, and that was going to be difficult. She was traumatized, withdrawn, and afraid. And Greg Turner? He knew how to lie. Judge Margaret Holloway entered the courtroom. She was in her mid-50s, sharp-eyed and composed. She had presided over countless cases, and her reputation was that of a no-nonsense judge who valued fairness above all else. She glanced at Lily, noting her small frame, her quiet demeanor, and the way she leaned slightly toward her dog. Then she banged her gavel. Court is now in session. Daniel Reeves stood first, buttoning his suit jacket. He turned to the jury, making deliberate eye contact. Ladies and gentlemen, today we seek justice for an innocent child. His voice was measured but firm. A child who has endured things no one should ever experience. The evidence will show that Greg Turner did, in fact, physically and emotionally harm his stepdaughter, Lily Carter. And while the defense will try to claim there is no proof, he paused, glancing at Greg. The truth has a way of coming to light. He nodded toward Lily, his voice softening. This little girl has been through hell, and today we will prove it. He took his seat. Mark Langley rose next, buttoning his own suit. Members of the jury, he began, his tone smooth, persuasive. This case is built on assumptions and emotions. The prosecution wants you to believe my client is a monster. But let's talk about the facts. He took a few measured steps. There is no direct evidence that Greg Turner harmed Lily Carter. No eyewitnesses, no security footage, no confessions. What we have is a frightened child and a devoted stepfather who is now fighting for his reputation and his freedom. Langley gestured toward Greg. My client has never been arrested before. He is a respected businessman, a community leader. He turned back to the jury. And today you will see that these accusations are not what they seem. He sat down. Greg gave him an approving nod. The trial moved quickly. First, a medical examiner took the stand. He confirmed that Lily had suffered injuries consistent with physical abuse, bruises, fractures that had started healing before being reported, signs of long-term trauma. Langley countered with a calm, practiced response. Doctor, isn't it true that children get bruises all the time? The examiner hesitated. Yes, but... And isn't it possible that these injuries could have come from, say, a fall off a bicycle, playing rough at the playground? The examiner frowned. That would depend. No further questions. Langley sat back, satisfied. Next came Sarah Carter, Lily's mother. She took the stand with hesitant steps, her hands twisting in her lap. Mrs. Carter, Daniel Reeves began. Did you witness Greg Turner harming your daughter? Sarah froze. Greg's eyes bore into her from across the room. She looked down. I don't know. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Langley stood. Mrs. Carter, are you saying that Greg never hurt Lily? Sarah's mouth opened, but no words came out. Langley nodded sympathetically. Mrs. Carter, I understand this must be hard for you, but would you say Greg is a loving husband? She nodded. And a good stepfather? More hesitation. Then, another small nod. Langley turned to the jury. No further questions. Daniel Reeves clenched his jaw. Sarah was too scared to tell the truth, and Langley knew it. Then, the moment everyone had been waiting for. Prosecution calls Lily Carter to the stand. The courtroom fell silent. Lily walked slowly, Scout trotting beside her. Judge Holloway's brow furrowed. Mr. Reeves, she said, I understand the importance of this testimony, but the child looks distressed. Reeves hesitated. Your Honor, Lily is nonverbal due to trauma. However, Scout is her therapy dog and his presence is crucial to her ability to communicate. Langley scoffed. Your Honor, are we really allowing a dog to influence court proceedings? Judge Holloway raised a hand. Mr. Langley, therapy dogs are allowed in cases of child trauma. If it helps the witness, I will allow it. Langley bit the inside of his cheek. Lily took her seat. Reeves crouched slightly so he wasn't towering over her. Lily, he said gently, I know this is hard, but you are safe here. No one can hurt you, okay? Lily didn't respond. Scout nudged. Her hand. Reeves tried again. Lily, can you tell us what happened? Still nothing. Langley sighed dramatically. Your Honor, I think we've made our point. But then, Lily's fingers twitched, a subtle movement. She raised 2 fingers near her knee, and Scout reacted. Instantly. The golden retriever sat up, ears alert, eyes locked on Greg Turner. Then, he let out a low, warning growl. The entire courtroom froze. Judge Holloway leaned forward. What just happened? Reeves glanced at the therapist in the audience, who quickly stood. Your Honor, the therapist said, stepping forward. Scout is trained to detect distress signals. Lily just gave a silent command. Greg shifted in his seat. Reeves turned, back to Lily. Lily, is Greg Turner lying? Lily nodded. Scout barked sharply. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Judge Holloway banged her gavel. Order! Order in the court! Greg's face paled. Langley stiffened, and Daniel Reeves? He smiled, because, for the first time in the entire trial, Lily had spoken, without saying a word. The courtroom had never been this quiet. The air was thick with anticipation, every breath held, every heartbeat waiting. Judge Margaret Holloway tapped her gavel, but it wasn't the sound that held everyone's attention. It was the dog. Scout, Lily's golden retriever, was rigid, his body low, muscles tense. His deep, rumbling growl filled the courtroom, breaking the silence like a distant thunderclap before a storm. Lily hadn't spoken, but she didn't have to. Lily Carter sat small and motionless in the massive courtroom chair. The wooden armrests dwarfed her as her fingers tightened in Scout's fur. Her feet barely touched the ground. For the last 20 minutes, Daniel Reeves, the prosecutor, had been trying to get her to speak. But she couldn't. Not with him sitting, across from her. Greg Turner sat with perfect composure, his suit crisp, his expression one of mild concern, like a man falsely accused of something ridiculous. He exuded calm confidence, as if the trial were nothing more than a nuisance. Langley, his defense attorney, had exploited Lily's silence mercilessly. This is your star witness? Langley scoffed, gesturing toward her. This child has not said a word. Not to the court, not to the jury, not to anyone. Reeves stood firm. She has already given a nonverbal testimony. A dog barking is not evidence, Langley countered, folding his hands smugly. The jury looked uneasy. The momentary shock of Scout's first reaction had started to fade. Langley was planting doubt, shifting the narrative. Then, Greg did something unexpected. He raised his hand. Your Honor, he said smoothly. I'd like to testify. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Holloway raised an eyebrow. Mr. Turner, your attorney should be advising you on this. I have nothing to hide. Greg's voice was measured, confident. I'm tired of sitting here listening to these accusations. Let me speak. Langley hesitated. He hadn't planned for this. But seeing the jury's reaction, he gave a small nod. Very well. Greg stood and walked toward the witness stand. Greg took his oath and sat down, folding his hands. He looked at ease, as if he were in a business meeting rather than a criminal trial. Langley approached him first. Mr. Turner, can you tell us about your relationship with Lily Carter? Greg let out a soft sigh. Of course. Lily. She's a wonderful kid. I love her like my own. From the prosecution table, Daniel Reeves's jaw clenched. And these allegations that you harmed her? Langley asked. Greg shook his head, looking genuinely pained. It's devastating, it truly is. I never laid a hand on that child. He turned toward the jury, his voice thick with controlled emotion. I took care of her, provided for her. I married her mother because I loved her. I took Lily in as my own. In the back of the courtroom, a reporter scribbled furiously. This is a tragic misunderstanding, Greg continued. I understand that Lily has been through trauma, but I am not a monster. Lily stared at him, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. Greg turned toward her, his expression soft but his eyes cold. You know that, don't you, Lily? For a moment, no one breathed. Lily didn't move, didn't blink. And then, She made a choice. It was small. So small, most people didn't notice. Lily lowered her left hand beside her chair and raised 2 fingers. To an outsider, it was nothing. A simple movement, a child fidgeting, but Scout knew. The golden retriever's ears snapped up. His body went rigid. And then he barked. Not just once, again, and again, and again. Sharp, authoritative, warning barks. Greg froze mid-sentence. Scout lunged forward, only restrained by his leash, his growls now vicious, teeth bared. Gasps erupted across the courtroom. "Order!" Judge Holloway slammed her gavel down. "Control that dog." But Scout wouldn't stop. He wasn't barking at just anyone. He was barking at Greg. Daniel Reeves stood immediately. "Your Honor, I request a recess." Langley shot up from his seat, pointing a furious finger at the dog. "This is absurd. Are we really going to allow a dog's reaction to determine guilt?" Judge Holloway hesitated, looking shaken. Scout hadn't reacted to anything else in the entire trial. Not the judge, not the jury, not the crowded room. But the second Greg spoke directly to Lily, the dog had lost it. Greg's face had paled. Langley turned toward him. "Sir." Greg stood abruptly. I need a moment." The confidence was cracking. Judge Holloway, regaining her composure, nodded. "We will take a short recess. Court is adjourned for 15 minutes. The second the gavel struck, Greg Turner bolted for the side exit. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Greg gripped the sink in the men's bathroom, breathing heavily. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He'd controlled the narrative, had twisted Lily's silence into doubt, had made Sarah too afraid to speak against him. And yet, that damn dog. His hands curled into fists. That mutt had ruined everything. For the first time in the trial, he was losing control. The door swung open. Langley entered, his expression unreadable. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. Greg exhaled sharply. "That dog is trained to make me look guilty. This is manipulation, Mark. You need to shut it down." Langley studied him. "You seemed pretty rattled back there." Greg whirled on him. "Because this whole thing is a joke, a child who doesn't even talk. Her word against mine. This trial should be over already." Langley's face remained impassive. "I don't need you losing your temper, Greg. This jury is still undecided. But that dog's reaction? It made an impact." Greg's jaw tightened. "Then fix it," Langley sighed, rubbing his temples. "First, we control the media narrative. We spin the dog's reaction as meaningless. Then we focus on closing arguments. If the jury doesn't have solid proof, reasonable doubt is on our side." Greg inhaled deeply. "Fine, just do your job." Langley nodded once and exited. Greg splashed water on his face, forcing himself to breathe. This wasn't over. Not yet. But deep down, for the first time, Greg Turner felt fear. As the recess ended, the energy in the courtroom had shifted. Judge Holloway sat, clearly still thinking about what had happened. Langley was already preparing his damage control speech, and Lily? She sat quietly beside Scout, one hand still resting in his fur. She didn't need words, because for the first time, everyone had heard her, without her saying a single thing. And as she watched her stepfather sweat for the first time, Lily Carter finally felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. The courtroom was on edge. A storm of murmurs rippled through the crowd, a low hum of uncertainty and disbelief. The jury exchanged glances. The reporters scribbled furiously, some already tapping out headlines on their phones. The dog had reacted twice. Once when Lily raised her fingers, and again when Greg Turner spoke directly to her. Judge Margaret Holloway tapped her gavel, but the confusion remained. The tension hung thick in the air like a taut rope ready to snap. Daniel Reeves, ever the strategist, felt it immediately. An opening. A small crack in Greg's carefully curated facade. This wasn't just a child's silence anymore. Something deeper was happening. Reeves stood adjusting his suit. His eyes scanned the jury, then turned back to the defense table. "Your Honor," he began, "something crucial just happened in this courtroom. I'd like to clarify it before we move forward. Langley sighed audibly, shaking his head. Your Honor, are we really going to waste time on... Judge Holloway raised a hand, silencing him. Let's hear what Mr. Reeves has to say. Langley gritted his teeth but said nothing. Reeves turned toward Lily Carter, still seated at the witness stand. Scout sat beside her, alert but calm, his golden fur bristling slightly. Lily, Reeves said softly. Earlier you made a gesture. A small one. Can you do it again? Lily hesitated. The courtroom held its breath. Then, she did it. 2 fingers raised at her side. Scout immediately reacted. His ears snapped up, his body tensed, and a deep, warning growl rumbled from his throat. This time, the jury noticed everything. One of the jurors, an older woman with kind eyes, leaned forward, her brows furrowed in concern. Another juror, a young man in his 20s, exchanged a glance with the others. Judge Holloway straightened in her seat. Mr. Reeves, what exactly are you implying? Reeves turned toward the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to call an expert, witness who can help explain this. Langley shot to his feet. This is absurd. We are not putting a dog on trial. I'm not calling the dog, Reeves countered. I'm calling the person who trained him. Langley froze. Reeves turned toward the back of the room. The prosecution calls Dr. Emily Vaughn, trauma therapist and service dog specialist. Dr. Emily Vaughn was a no-nonsense woman in her early 40s. Dressed in a simple yet professional gray suit, she walked to the stand with an air of quiet authority. Her presence alone commanded respect. After taking the oath, she sat down, folding her hands neatly. Dr. Vaughn, Reeves began, can you explain your qualifications to the court? I am a licensed trauma therapist specializing in nonverbal communication and abuse survivors, she said. Additionally, I train therapy and service dogs to assist individuals with PTSD, anxiety disorders, and, she glanced at Lily, children who have experienced severe trauma. Reeves nodded. And Scout, Lily's therapy dog, was trained by you, correct? Yes. Langley sat up straighter, his face tense. And can you tell the court what exactly Scout was trained to do? Dr. Vaughn's eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Greg Turner before she answered. Scout is trained to recognize specific distress signals, particularly nonverbal cues in children who cannot or will not speak about their trauma. Distress signals? Reeves echoed. Dr. Vaughn nodded. Children who have suffered prolonged abuse often develop silent ways to communicate, especially if they fear retaliation. Lily's gesture, she mimicked the subtle raising of 2 fingers, is a command that tells Scout that something is wrong, that she is in distress. A ripple of unease spread through the room. Langley stood abruptly. Objection. This is all speculation. A dog is not a trained detective. Dr. Vaughn turned to him sharply. With all due respect, Mr. Langley, Scout is trained better than some detectives. The jury chuckled softly. Judge Holloway hid a smirk, but raised a hand. Mr. Langley, let the witness continue. Langley sat down, fuming. Reeves took a step forward. Dr. Vaughn, earlier today, Scout didn't just react to Lily's signal. He also reacted when Greg Turner spoke. Yes. What does that mean? Dr. Vaughn exhaled, her expression darkening. It means Scout wasn't just reacting to Lily's distress. She turned to the jury, her voice steady and certain. Scout was reacting to a lie. Silence. Absolute deafening silence. For the first time since the trial began, Greg Turner didn't look so confident. He stiffened in his seat, his hands gripping the table just a little too tightly. Langley's jaw twitched, but he couldn't object. Not now, not after the jury had seen it with their own eyes. Judge Holloway folded her hands. Dr. Vaughn, she said, you're telling this court that Scout has been trained to detect when someone is lying? Yes, Your Honor, Dr. Vaughn replied. Scout isn't just responding to fear, he's responding to dishonesty. And when Greg Turner spoke to Lily, she turned toward Greg, her eyes sharp. Scout perceived it as a direct threat. A journalist whispered, Jesus Christ, as he typed furiously. Langley forced himself to stand. This is ridiculous. You can't seriously expect this court to convict a man based on a dog's reaction. Judge Holloway tapped her fingers on the desk, deep in thought. Dr. Vaughn, she asked, how reliable is Scout's training? Extremely, Dr. Vaughn answered without hesitation. He has been tested repeatedly in controlled environments and has a 96% accuracy rate in identifying deception and distress. Reeves jumped on that immediately. 96% accuracy, he repeated, turning toward the jury. And twice now in this very courtroom, Scout has identified a lie. Langley's face turned red. This is outrageous. Are we seriously entertaining canine psychology as evidence? This is a court of law. Judge Holloway sighed. I agree that we cannot convict a man based on a dog's reaction alone. Langley smirked, about to sit down. But, the judge continued, her tone sharp, we can consider it in the context of Lily Carter's silent testimony. Langley's smirk vanished. Judge Holloway turned to Lily, her expression softer now. Miss Carter, she said gently, I know you are afraid. I know this is hard. But you are not alone here. She glanced at Scout, then back at Lily. You have been speaking this whole time, even without words. Lily blinked. A tear slipped down her cheek. Greg shifted uncomfortably. Judge Holloway turned back to Dr. Vaughn. I believe this warrants further examination. Langley gritted his teeth. Reeves hid his smile. Because now, the jury had seen Greg Turner react, and he did not look like an innocent man. The energy in the courtroom had shifted. Greg Turner sat stiffly at the defense table, his composure visibly eroding. His hands were folded tightly, his jaw clenched just a little too hard. He wasn't the calm, collected businessman anymore. He was a man on edge. The jury had noticed. Judge Margaret Holloway had noticed. And Daniel Reeves? He wasn't about to let go of this moment. Mark Langley could feel the shift in the air, and it made his stomach turn. This wasn't supposed to happen. His strategy had been simple. Discredit the child's silence, paint her as confused, and emphasize the lack of physical evidence. But now the case had turned into something far worse. Langley stood, buttoning his jacket in an attempt to look composed. Your Honor, he began, his tone calm but forceful. I need to address this so-called evidence before we move forward. Judge Holloway raised an eyebrow but gestured for him to continue. Langley turned to the jury, his hands spread out in mock sympathy. We are now entertaining the idea that a dog's reaction, a reaction which could be due to anything, mind you, is enough to cast serious doubt on my client's innocence. He shook his head as if the very notion was laughable. We have no idea why the dog barked. Maybe it was the tone of voice. Maybe it was a random movement. Or maybe, just maybe, this dog has been trained to react in a way that benefits the prosecution. A few jury members shifted uncomfortably. It was a calculated move. If he could create even a sliver of doubt about Scout's reliability, he could start pulling the jury back in Greg's favor. He turned to Dr. Emily Vaughn, still seated in the witness stand. Dr. Vaughn, he said, voice dripping with skepticism. As a so-called expert in therapy dogs, can you tell me for certain that Scout's reaction is not just a conditioned behavior? Dr. Vaughn didn't blink. Yes, she said simply. Langley faltered for just half a second before forcing a smirk. Oh? So you're telling this court that a dog, an animal, has the ability to detect guilt beyond any human understanding? Doctor, Vaughn tilted her head slightly. No. I'm telling this court that Scout can detect distress and deception. And I'm telling you that the only time he's reacted in this courtroom is when Greg Turner has spoken. A murmur spread through the crowd again. Langley's smirk faded. But before he could recover, Reeves stood up. Your Honor, Reeves said smoothly, since the defense has raised the issue of the dog's credibility, I'd like to conduct a simple test. Langley turned sharply. A test? Judge Holloway adjusted her glasses, intrigued. Go on, Mr. Reeves. Reeves walked toward Lily, his movements slow and deliberate. He crouched slightly so that his gaze was level with hers. Lily, he said gently, I know speaking is hard for you right now, But I have an idea. She stared at him, wide-eyed. I'm going to ask yes or no questions, Reeves explained. You don't have to say a word. Just sit there with Scout. Lily hesitated, then gave a tiny nod. Reeves smiled reassuringly before straightening up. Then he turned toward Greg. Langley immediately objected. Absolutely not. Overruled, Judge Holloway said, curiosity evident in her voice. Proceed, Mr. Reeves. Langley fumed but stayed quiet. Reeves adjusted his tie, then turned to Greg. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. Greg Turner, Reeves said. Did you ever physically harm Lily Carter? Greg scoffed, feigning offense. Of course not, Scout barked. The noise was sharp, startling. A few jurors flinched. Greg's expression tightened. Reeves nodded slowly, as if he had expected that. He turned back to Greg. Did you ever threaten Lily Carter? Greg shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips. And never. Scout barked again. This time it was louder. Langley bolted upright. This is ridiculous. A dog barking is not a polygraph test. Reeves ignored him, taking another step closer. His voice lowered, his words deliberate. Greg, he said, his gaze locking onto him. Did you ever tell Lily that if she spoke, something bad would happen to her? Greg's jaw clenched. No, Scout barked, and this time the bark turned into a snarl. The jury stiffened. Greg shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his tie. This is absurd. The dog is just barking because... But the cracks were showing. The once charming, confident businessman was now visibly sweating. Reeves didn't let up. Greg, he said, his tone almost casual now. Did you tell Lily that no one would believe her if she spoke? Greg opened his mouth. Scout let out a ferocious, guttural growl. It was the kind of sound that came from pure instinct. A warning. A reaction that couldn't be faked. And this time, Greg Turner looked genuinely afraid. Langley jumped to his feet. Again. This is nothing more than courtroom theatrics. My client does not have to sit here and be barked at like a criminal. Judge Holloway tilted her head. Then perhaps your client should stop lying. Langley's face turned red. Reeves stepped forward, lowering his voice. Greg Turner, did you hurt Lily Carter? Greg sat completely still. His hands trembled slightly. His gaze flickered to Lily, just for a split second, and in that moment, everyone saw it. The guilt. The panic. Scout let out one final, earth-shattering bark. The silence that followed was heavier than ever before. Langley ran a hand over his face, trying to regain control. Greg was losing it. The jury saw it. The judge saw it. The press was already whispering and taking notes. Reeves stepped back, allowing the moment to sink in. Then he turned to the judge. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Holloway nodded. We will take a short recess. Gavel strike. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as Greg Turner stood abruptly, his face pale, his movements jerky. Langley grabbed his arm, whispering urgently, but Greg shoved him off. Then, without a word, Greg Turner stormed out of the courtroom. The jury watched him go, and at the witness stand, Lily Carter sat still, her small hand resting in Scout's fur. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel afraid. Because she had spoken, and for once, people were listening. The courtroom was buzzing with energy, the weight of Greg Turner's unraveling lies hanging in the air like an approaching storm. The jury had seen it. The judge had seen it. And most importantly, Sarah Carter had seen it. She sat in the back of the courtroom, clutching her hands in her lap, her body trembling. Her heart pounded painfully against her ribs. She had spent years trying to convince herself that what had happened wasn't as bad as she thought, that maybe she had imagined it, that maybe if she stayed silent, it would all just go away. But now the whole world had seen Greg for what he truly was. And Sarah Carter couldn't pretend anymore. Sarah's fingers dug into her palms, her breathing uneven. She could feel the eyes on her, some curious, some knowing. She had spent so long convincing herself that she was powerless, that there was no way out. And then she heard it, the softest sound. A small sniffle. She turned her head. Lily sat in the witness chair, still silent, still pale. But something about her looked different now. She wasn't curled in on herself the way she usually was. She wasn't shrinking. Sarah's breath hitched. Lily had been strong, stronger than she had ever been. Sarah had spent so many nights promising herself that she would protect her daughter, that next time she would leave, that next time she wouldn't let Greg get away with it, and yet here they were. Lily had been the one to expose him, not her. Sarah choked back a sob, guilt hitting her like a tidal wave. She had failed her daughter, and she knew, if she didn't speak now, she would fail her again. The courtroom fell into hushed murmurs as the sound of Sarah's sobs became audible. Judge Holloway's gaze shifted to the back of the room, her sharp eyes locking onto the trembling woman. "Mrs. Carter," she said, her voice even but firm. "Do you have something to say?" Sarah's throat tightened. All eyes were on her now. Greg was watching too, his jaw clenched, his face stone cold, daring her. For years she had seen that look and shrank back into silence. But today, she refused. With a shuddering breath, Sarah pushed herself up from her seat. I need to speak," she said, her voice breaking but determined. Langley shot to his feet. "Objection. Mrs. Carter is not on the witness list. This is completely inappropriate. She is the victim's mother," Judge Holloway cut in, raising an eyebrow. "And it seems she has something relevant to say. I'll allow it." Langley threw his hands in the air, but it didn't matter. Sarah was already walking toward the front of the courtroom. She didn't look at Greg. Not once. Sarah sat down at the witness stand, hands clasped in her lap. Reeves approached her slowly, his expression careful. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "you have been sitting here this whole trial. You've heard the testimony, seen the evidence. Can you tell the court why you are speaking now?" Sarah swallowed hard. "Because..." Her voice shook, but she forced herself to keep going. "Because I can't stay quiet anymore." Greg shifted uncomfortably at the defense table. Langley leaned in, whispering urgently in his ear, but Greg ignored him. His gaze was locked onto Sarah, his fingers twitching against the table. Reeves nodded. "You were in a relationship with the defendant, Greg Turner, correct?" Sarah's eyes darkened. "Yes." "And did you ever witness him harming your daughter?" Langley shot up again. "Objection, leading question." Sustained. Judge Holloway eyed Reeves. "Rephrase, Mr. Reeves." Reeves gave a slight nod before turning back to Sarah. "Mrs. Carter, in your own words, can you describe your experience living with Greg Turner?" Sarah's breath shuddered out of her. She glanced at Lily, who was now watching her closely, and suddenly Sarah Carter felt something she hadn't felt in years. Determined, so she told the truth. At first, he was charming, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "He made me feel safe. Made me think he loved Lily." She hesitated, her hands tightening in her lap. But then, things changed. The courtroom was dead silent. Greg's jaw tensed. Sarah's voice grew stronger. He became controlling, angry, and whenever he was in a bad mood, Lily was the easiest target. A collective murmur spread through the audience. "I tried to stop it," Sarah continued, tears brimming in her eyes. "I really did. But he always said if I left, he'd make sure I never saw Lily again." The guilt weighed heavy on her. But she pushed forward. She turned and looked at Greg Turner for the first time since she took the stand. "You told me no one would believe me." Her voice wavered, but she didn't break eye contact. "You told Lily no one would believe her." She swallowed hard, "But they believe us now." The silence in the courtroom was thick. Greg gripped the edge of the defense table, his knuckles turning white. His cool demeanor was slipping, his control cracking. Langley leaned in, whispering, "Don't react. Stay calm." But Greg wasn't, listening. His face burned with rage, and suddenly he snapped, "You ungrateful." Greg stood so abruptly his chair skidded back, his voice rising in fury. "You would have had nothing without me. I gave you a home, I gave you everything." Langley's face turned pale. "Greg, and this is how you repay me?" Greg shouted, his gaze locking onto Sarah like a predator cornering its prey. But he wasn't scaring her anymore. Because Sarah wasn't the same woman he had controlled for years. She was free. "Mr. Turner, sit down." Judge Holloway's voice boomed, but Greg wasn't listening. He turned toward the jury, his face twisted in frustration. "You don't get it. She's lying. She's always been weak." Scout growled, a deep, menacing sound. Greg flinched, and that's when it hit him. He had lost control. Completely. The jury saw everything now. The anger, the manipulation, the cruelty beneath the polished surface. Greg, Turner had just convicted himself. Judge Holloway sighed heavily, rubbing her temples. "We will be taking a recess. Gavel strike." But the damage was done. Greg Turner wasn't the untouchable businessman anymore. He was a cornered man, and everyone knew it. The weight of the moment settled over the courtroom like a storm about to break. Greg Turner's outburst had shattered his carefully crafted image, but Daniel Reeves wasn't finished yet. The jury had seen Greg lose control and had heard Sarah's tearful testimony. But emotion alone wouldn't convict him. They needed hard evidence, and Reeves had plenty of it. Greg sat back down, his hands clenching and unclenching on the defense table. His lawyer, Mark Langley, leaned in, whispering furiously. "Do you have any idea how bad that looked?" Langley hissed under his breath. "You just proved their entire case for them." Greg's jaw tightened. "That woman is a liar." Langley exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Greg felt the weight of the jury's eyes on him. The way they were looking at him now, with suspicion, with disgust. They didn't see a respectable businessman anymore. They saw a monster, and it was only going to get worse. Reeves approached the evidence table with deliberate precision, setting down a stack of documents. He looked up at Judge Holloway. "The prosecution would like to submit Lily Carter's medical records into evidence." Langley stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. Irrelevant. Children fall down all the time." "Judge," Holloway narrowed her eyes. "Are you seriously arguing that a child's past injuries are irrelevant in an abuse trial, Mr. Langley?" Langley's mouth snapped shut. Reeves didn't waste time. He picked up the first medical report. According to this hospital record, Lily Carter was brought to the emergency room 3 times over the last 2 years. Each time her mother stated she had fallen or tripped. He moved to the next document. Here's another record from her pediatrician. A fractured wrist, bruises along her ribs. A murmur spread through the jury box. Then Reeves held up a final report. "This one," he said, his voice lowering, "details a hairline fracture on Lily's collarbone. The doctor specifically noted that the injury was not consistent with a simple fall." Greg's face turned rigid. Langley stood again. "None of these prove my client was involved." Reeves turned to him, expression unreadable. "You're absolutely right," he said, voice cool. "So let's keep going." Reeves walked back to the prosecution table and pulled out a small flash drive. He turned to Judge Holloway. "Your Honor, we have something else. New evidence that the defense has not yet reviewed." Langley's face darkened. "This is a violation of disclosure laws." Reeves raised an eyebrow. The defense had every opportunity to request the neighbor's police report before trial. If they had, they would have found this. Judge Holloway nodded. "Proceed." Reeves plugged the flash drive into a small speaker. A moment later, a voice crackled through the speakers. A man's voice. Greg's voice. "If you tell anyone, I swear to God I will make you regret it." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Greg's face went pale. Langley shot up again. "Objection. We have no proof that's my client's voice." Reeves remained calm. "Actually, we do." He pressed play again. This time, the voice was clearer. "Stop crying. You think anyone is going to believe you, huh? You're just a stupid little girl." The words echoed in the silent courtroom. Reeves let the recording hang in the air for a moment before he turned back to the jury. This recording was captured by a concerned neighbor, the same neighbor who called the police on the night of 4. Greg Turner's arrest. Langley gritted his teeth. Reeves walked toward the jury, his voice measured, controlled. The defense has repeatedly claimed that we have no proof, that this case is based on the words of a confused child and a barking dog. He gestured to the speaker. But that is Greg Turner, in his own words. A juror, a woman in her 40s, visibly swallowed. Greg's foot tapped anxiously beneath the table, and Reeves wasn't finished. "We would like to call our next witness," Reeves said, turning toward the back of the courtroom. A woman, mid-50s, glasses, dressed in a modest blouse and blazer, stood from her seat and made her way to the witness stand. She looked nervous but determined. "Please state your name for the court." She cleared her throat. "Angela Hopkins." Reeves nodded. "Ms. Hopkins, can you tell us why you called 911 on the night of Greg Turner's arrest?" Angela's hands tightened in her lap. I heard screaming. A child. It wasn't the first time." She glanced at Lily, her eyes full of sadness. "I wanted to call before. So many times. But I was scared. He was powerful. No one else said anything, so I kept telling myself maybe I was wrong. But that night, I heard her crying. I heard him shouting. Her eyes hardened, and I knew if I stayed quiet I'd never forgive myself." Langley sighed sharply, standing up. "Ms. Hopkins, did you ever actually witness my client striking Lily Carter?" Angela didn't hesitate. "No, but I didn't need to. I heard him." She turned back to the jury. I heard her. The impact of her words was palpable. Another juror, an older man, rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Greg was running out of places to hide. The courtroom felt electric. The jury had heard the medical records. They had heard Greg's own voice threatening a child. They had heard from a terrified neighbor who had finally spoken up. And then, there was Scout. Even without understanding the science, the jury had felt the truth in the dog's reactions. Piece by piece, the carefully constructed facade of Greg Turner had crumbled to dust. Greg leaned toward Langley, voice sharp but hushed. "We need a deal." Langley's expression was grim. "There is no deal, Greg," he muttered. "Not anymore." Greg sat back, his body rigid. His face, once confident, smug, was now stiff with panic. He had spent years manipulating, controlling, silencing those around him. But now the world had heard the truth, and there was no escaping it. The weight of the trial's conclusion hung over the courtroom like a thundercloud, heavy with anticipation. 12 jurors, 12 people who now held Greg Turner's fate in their hands. They had listened, they had watched, and now they would decide. The bailiff escorted the jury out of the courtroom and into the deliberation room. The doors shut behind them and the air felt thick with unspoken tension. For the first time since the trial began, the room was silent. No testimonies, no objections, no outbursts, just waiting. Lily sat on a bench outside the courtroom, Scout curled up beside her, his head resting gently on her lap. Her small hands gripped his fur tightly, as if afraid that without him she might disappear entirely. Sarah Carter sat next to her daughter, rubbing gentle circles into her back. She had expected Lily to shake, to cry, to curl into herself like she usually did, but she didn't. Instead, she sat still, her tiny fingers buried deep in Scout's fur, not speaking, but breathing. And for Lily Carter, that was enough. Inside the deliberation room, the jurors sat around a long wooden table, their faces drawn in deep thought. At the head of the table, the jury forewoman, a woman in her mid-50s with sharp eyes and a firm posture, folded her hands. "Let's begin," she said. A young man to her right, a schoolteacher, sighed, running a hand through his hair. This isn't a hard decision, is it?" he asked, glancing around. The older man next to him, a retired police officer, shook his head. "Not for me. I've seen guys like Greg Turner before. They wear suits and pretend they're civilized. His fingers tapped against the table. "Until you see them lose control." Several heads nodded. The woman at the far end of the table, an accountant with a no-nonsense demeanor, looked thoughtful. "The dog," she said suddenly. The forewoman turned to her. "What about it?" The way Scout reacted. "I know, legally, we can't convict someone because a dog barked, but watching it happen?" She exhaled sharply. That was real. Silence fell over the group. Then the forewoman reached for a small slip of paper. "Let's take the vote." She picked up a pen and began to write. A full hour had passed before the jury filed back into the courtroom. Everyone stood as they returned to their seats. Judge Holloway remained poised behind the bench, her expression unreadable. Lily's grip on Scout tightened. Greg sat rigid at the defense table, his face still, too still. His jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists. The once smooth charm he had tried so desperately to maintain was gone. Langley sat beside him, shoulders stiff, as if he already knew what was coming. Judge Holloway turned to the jury. "Madam Forewoman, has the jury reached a verdict?" The forewoman stood. "Yes, Your Honor. We have." The bailiff took the slip of paper from her hands and carried it to the judge. Judge Holloway read it carefully. Then, she turned back to the courtroom. "In the case of the state versus Gregory Turner, on the charge of aggravated child abuse, how does the jury find?" The forewoman lifted her chin. "Guilty." The courtroom erupted. Sarah let out a sharp breath, pressing her hands to her mouth, her body shaking with relief. Lily didn't move, but Scout did. The golden retriever lifted his head and nudged her hand, as if telling her, "It's over. You're safe." For the first time, Lily let out a shaky breath. And then, she nodded. Not a word. Just a nod. But to Sarah, to Daniel Reeves, to everyone who had fought for this moment, it was everything. The courtroom was still buzzing when Judge Holloway held up her hand. "Order," she called firmly. "Order in the court." Slowly, the noise died down. Greg Turner, however, was far from silent. He had gone stiff at first, his face a mask of blank disbelief. Then, as if something inside him finally snapped, he turned, violently, toward his lawyer. "Do something," Greg roared, slamming his hands against the table so hard that a nearby clerk flinched. Langley leaned away, his face blank. "There's nothing to do, Greg," he muttered. "It's over." That was the wrong thing to say, because suddenly, Greg Turner lost control. "This is a joke," he shouted, shoving back his chair so violently it crashed to the floor. The bailiff surged forward, but Greg was already standing, his face red with fury. "You think I'm just gonna sit here while you destroy my life?" he bellowed, his entire body seething with rage. The jury stiffened. Judge Holloway's face hardened, and the bailiffs moved in. Greg Turner wasn't untouchable anymore, and the world saw it. As the bailiffs grabbed his arms, Greg struggled violently, his teeth clenched in pure, unfiltered hatred. "You think she's innocent?" he shouted, his voice directed at Sarah. "She let it happen. She's just as guilty as me." Scout snarled, stepping in front of Lily protectively. Sarah flinched, but she didn't look away. Because Greg Turner's mask was gone, and everyone saw him for who he was, a violent, manipulative coward, a monster. Judge Holloway's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice steady, "you have done nothing but prove to this courtroom exactly why you belong behind bars." Greg thrashed again, his face twisted in fury. "You can't do this to me. I'm not—" Slam! The gavel struck down. "Mr. Turner, you are sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed by law." Greg froze. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Holloway's gaze was unwavering. "You will never hurt that child again." The bailiffs dragged him back, his voice erupting into curses, but it didn't matter, because the verdict was final, and Greg Turner was done. Lily watched as Greg was hauled away. For the first time in her young life, he wasn't a shadow lurking in the corners. He wasn't a voice whispering threats in the dark. He was gone. She reached out, fingers still tangled in Scout's fur, and for the first time since the trial began, she smiled. It was small, barely noticeable. But Sarah Carter saw, and for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. The courtroom was empty now. The echo of Greg Turner's outburst had long since faded, leaving behind only a tense stillness. Lily Carter sat on a wooden bench outside the courtroom, Scout pressed firmly against her side. His soft fur was warm beneath her fingers, grounding her in the present. She was safe. For the first time in her young life, she didn't have to worry about whispers behind doors or the sound of Greg's footsteps approaching her room at night. Greg, Turner was gone, but that didn't mean the fear had disappeared with him. It lingered in the shadows. It clung to her like a ghost. And Lily wasn't sure if it would ever go away. Sarah Carter watched her daughter carefully, her heart aching with guilt. She wanted to say something, to apologize, to tell Lily that she had been blind and weak and afraid, that she should have protected her, should have stood up for her before it ever came to this. But Lily wouldn't even look at her, and Sarah didn't blame her. Instead, she spoke in the only way she could. She reached forward, hesitant, and placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. Lily didn't pull away, but she didn't lean into it either. That alone broke Sarah's heart. By the time they left the courthouse, the world had already caught on. News vans lined the street. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, cameras flashing, microphones raised. Sarah hesitated at the doors. Lily, however, simply kept her head down. She didn't like the noise. She didn't like the attention. But Scout wasn't afraid. The golden retriever walked beside her, calm and steady. His presence was enough to remind Lily that she wasn't alone, that she would never be alone again. Sarah lifted a protective hand over Lily's head, shielding her from the flashing lights as they stepped outside. Instantly, the crowd erupted. "Lily, how are you feeling? Mrs. Carter, do you regret staying silent? Daniel Reeves, do you believe this trial will change future legal cases?" Cameras clicked. Questions flew, but none of them mattered, because at the center of it all, one thing stood out above everything else. Scout, over here," one reporter called, aiming a lens toward the golden retriever. "A trained therapy dog breaks the case wide open," another murmured into a microphone. "Experts are already debating the role of service animals in the justice system." One journalist, a young woman with glasses and a notepad, smiled warmly as she knelt in front of Lily. "You have a very special friend," she said gently. Lily said nothing, but she reached down, rubbing Scout's ears. And for a brief second, the young girl smiled. It was small, hardly noticeable, but it was real. That night, the story of the trial played on every major news channel. Therapy Dog uncovers the truth, how a little girl and her dog helped expose a monster. The world was watching. Scout had become more than just Lily's protector. He was a hero. Animal advocacy groups began praising therapy dogs for their incredible intuition and loyalty. Legal experts debated whether this case could set a precedent for service animals in courtrooms, and people wanted to meet him. Offers came flooding in. A national animal welfare organization wanted to honor Scout with a Hero Dog Award. A publishing house reached out to Daniel Reeves, interested in a book about the case. A major TV network requested an exclusive interview with Sarah and Lily. But for Lily, she didn't care about any of it. She just wanted to go home. While Sarah and Lily tried to piece together their future, someone else was watching the impact of the case unfold. Daniel Reeves sat in his office staring at the blinking cursor on his computer screen. An email from a major law journal had come in. "Mr. Reeves, we'd love for you to write an article on how nonverbal communication played a crucial role in this trial. We believe this case could reshape how we approach trauma victims in court." Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. This case had been unlike any other. He had built careers on powerful testimonies, on words. But this case? It had been about silence. Lily had never spoken in court, and yet her message had been clearer than any statement he'd ever heard. With a deep breath, Daniel began to type. Days passed. The world kept talking. But in a quiet little house far away, from the flashing cameras, Lily Carter was learning how to breathe again. Sarah Carter didn't push her daughter to talk. She didn't try to force apologies or explanations. Instead, she simply stayed. She cooked meals. She sat with Lily in silence. She let Scout curl up next to them on the couch as they watched old cartoons together. And slowly, very slowly, Lily began to trust again. One night, as Sarah tucked her daughter into bed, she hesitated at the doorway. She expected the usual silence, the small, barely there nod that Lily always gave when she was done talking for the night. But tonight, Lily looked up. She hesitated, and then, soft, small, barely above a whisper, "Mom?" Sarah froze. Tears burned her eyes. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. "Yes, sweetheart?" A long pause. Then, Lily reached out, taking Scout's paw in her hand. She glanced up at her mother, and for the first time in a long time, she spoke. "Can we get Scout a new toy tomorrow?" Sarah laughed through her tears. It wasn't about the toy, it wasn't about the dog. It was about something much, much more important. It was about healing. And for the first time in forever, Lily Carter was taking the first step forward. The world had moved on. The courtroom had emptied. The reporters had packed up their cameras, and the crowds had disappeared. But Lily Carter remained. She sat outside the courthouse on the cool stone steps, her small fingers twisting gently through Scout's golden fur. The sun had begun to set, casting a warm glow over the building's grand columns, making the whole place feel less intimidating than it had hours ago. Scout sat beside her, his tail flicking against the ground, his ears perked up, always alert, always watching over her. Sarah sat a few steps away, giving her daughter space but never leaving her side. She wasn't going to make that mistake again. For so long, Lily had been afraid of speaking. Words were dangerous. They could betray you. They could bring pain instead of comfort. She had learned, over time, that sometimes it was safer to stay quiet. And today, even though Greg Turner was gone, she still felt like his shadow clung to her. The fear wasn't gone just because he was. She had won the battle. But the war inside her was far from over. Scout rested his head on her knee, letting out a soft huff, as if sensing her thoughts. His quiet presence had always been enough, but today, Lily wished she could say something, anything. But the words just wouldn't come. Footsteps echoed behind her. Lily stiffened instinctively, but Scout remained calm. She looked up to see Judge Margaret Holloway walking toward them. Her long black robes were gone, replaced by a simple blazer and slacks. Without the official courtroom presence, she looked different, softer, less like a judge, more like a person. She knelt down, careful not to startle Lily, and studied her with those sharp yet kind eyes. "You did something very brave today," Judge Holloway said gently. Lily's fingers tightened in Scout's fur. She wasn't sure how to respond. She hadn't done anything. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't told the truth out loud. She hadn't been the one to stop Greg. All she had done was sit there frozen while everyone else fought the battle for her. So how could she be brave? The judge must have seen the doubt in her eyes because she smiled. "Bravery isn't about how loud you are," she said. "It's about standing up, even when you're afraid." Lily swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I've seen people 3 times your age cower in front of the truth," Judge Holloway continued. "You didn't. You let the truth come out in your own way. And that?" She nodded toward Scout. "That was extraordinary." Lily felt the words before she spoke them. They were small, tentative, like a bird testing its wings for the first time. Her lips parted. Her voice, so unused to being heard, was barely above a whisper. "Thank you." The words hung in the air, as delicate as glass. Scout's ears perked up at the sound, and he lifted, his head, his tail wagging immediately as if he understood the importance of this moment. Sarah froze on the steps, her breath caught in her throat. For months, Lily had spoken only in nods and gestures. For months, she had been locked inside her own world, unable to let herself be heard. And now she had taken the first step out of the silence. Judge Holloway didn't react with shock or surprise. She simply smiled and nodded, as if she had known all along that Lily would find her voice when she was ready. "You're very welcome," the judge said softly. Lily exhaled, her shoulders loosening slightly. The war inside her wasn't over, but today she had won a battle, and that was enough. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Sarah finally stepped closer, her hands wringing, nervously. Lily turned, looking up at her mother. For the first time in a long time, she didn't see fear in Sarah's eyes. She saw something else. Hope. "Are you ready to go home?" Sarah asked gently. Lily hesitated. Home. The word still felt strange to her. The house they had shared with Greg had never been home. It had been a place filled with tension and fear and whispered apologies. But now Greg was gone. And maybe, just maybe, home could finally mean something different. Lily nodded. Sarah's breath hitched and she smiled, blinking back tears. Scout barked happily, as if celebrating the decision, and Lily let out something she hadn't in a long time. A small, soft laugh. Sarah reached out a hand, hesitating for only a second before placing it gently in Lily's. Lily didn't pull away. She didn't squeeze back. But she let it stay. And for now, that was enough. As Lily, Scout, and Sarah walked down the courthouse steps, the world around them seemed less heavy than before. Greg Turner was no longer in their lives. The trial was over, and though there were still battles to fight, therapy sessions, nightmares, the long road to healing, Lily knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone anymore. Scout was by her side. Sarah was trying, and for the first time in a very, very long time, Lily believed that things might actually get better. The camera zooms out. Scout runs ahead, his tail wagging, his paws light on the pavement. Lily watches him go, and for the first time in months, her lips curve into a real, genuine smile. As she and Sarah step forward together, Lily takes one last look at the courthouse behind her. She doesn't feel afraid anymore. She doesn't feel trapped in silence. She feels free. And as she turns away, ready to start over, the screen fades to black.